When the police decide to investigate the house of a man who lives alone in his apartment, the officers are startled when the dog begins to bark uncontrollably at the huge teddy bear that was in the bedroom. When the officers decide to approach, the old man turns pale and the officers are shocked by what they saw. First off, if you, like us, love animals, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any exciting stories. Thanks. Now, back to our story. The soft light of dawn filtered through the lace curtains of the mansion in Oakwood Hills, casting delicate shadows on the toys scattered across the living room. Carol nervously adjusted her brown hair behind her ear as her eyes scanned every corner of the room, searching for any sign of her little Lily. The silence of the house was disturbing, broken only by the insistent ticking of an antique clock, a legacy from her mother, Helen. The sleepover the night before had gone normally, until the moment Lily, only 7 years old, complained of a headache and asked to retire early. Carol remembered the goodnight kiss, the scent of chamomile shampoo in her daughter's hair, and the promise that in the morning they would drink hot chocolate together, as they did every Sunday. But now, 24 hours later, the chocolate remained untouched in the kitchen, and Lily's room was empty. The other children from the party had left in the early afternoon the day before, and none of them remembered seeing the little hostess after she had gone to bed. Carol tried to ignore the knot that formed in her throat when she remembered the argument about the lessons. Lily loved playing the piano. It was her connection to her deceased grandfather. But Richard had insisted it was a waste of time and money. As on so many other occasions in recent months, she had yielded to his seemingly logical arguments. Finally, giving in to growing despair, Carol picked up the phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the police number, ignoring Richard's voice in the background, who insisted that she was exaggerating. A gentle voice answered on the other end of the line, and before she realized it, the words gushed out like a torrent. In less than an hour, the upper-middle-class condominium turned into a center of operations. Among the officers who arrived, Detective Miller stood out, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes and an unusual companion, Max, an imposing German shepherd with a gleaming canine badge on his collar. While Miller coordinated the initial searches around the condominium, Max sniffed every corner of the impeccably maintained garden. The dog briefly stopped in front of a bed of violets, Lily's favorite flowers, and let out a low whimper that made his trainer frown. Carol watched everything from the porch, her hands clutching a small music notebook found under Lily's bed. The pages were filled with childish musical notes and small hearts drawn in the margins. On the last page, an incomplete sentence caught her attention. "Dear Grandma Helen, I miss you so." The rest of the message had been torn off, leaving only an irregular trail of torn paper. Carol felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. She hadn't spoken to her mother for months, ever since Richard had entered her life. The sun began to set when Miller approached with a serious expression. "Mrs. Carroll, I need you to tell me more about these piano lessons your daughter used to take. Some neighbors mentioned that they used to see Lily walking alone around the neighborhood, always carrying a notebook like this." Before Carol could answer, Richard appeared at her side, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "That's completely irrelevant," he declared with authority. "The teacher was an eccentric old man who lived alone. We did Lily a favor by removing her from him." Professor Albert's house was in a small brick building, surrounded by a modest but well-maintained garden. Miller observed the building carefully as Max sniffed the stone path leading to the entrance. The dog showed no signs of agitation, only quiet curiosity. The professor, a 65-year-old gentleman with gray hair and delicate framed glasses, greeted the investigators with an expression of genuine concern. His apartment was a living testament to decades dedicated to music. Sheet music, carefully organized on shelves, a grand piano occupying a place of honor in the living room, and old photographs of musical performances decorating the walls. "Lily," Albert pronounced the name with evident affection, adjusting his glasses. She reminds me so much of her father when he was a child. Same passion for music, same sparkle in his eyes when playing. He walked to a bookcase and took out a photo album. See, this is a photo of her recital 3 months ago. In the photograph, Lily smiled radiantly sitting at the piano, her small hands gracefully positioned on the keys. Beside her, an elderly lady with silver hair applauded with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Helen, her grandmother, explained Albert. She came especially to see her granddaughter play. Albert sighed deeply, his gaze lost on the piano keys. Not directly, but Mrs. Helen would call me sometimes, worried. You know, I met Lily's grandfather at the conservatory. We were great friends. After he passed away, I promised that I would take care of the little girl, that I would help her keep his memory alive through music. While they talked, Max explored the apartment with interest, his tail swaying gently. The dog stopped in front of a slightly ajar door, sniffing more intently. It's just the guest room, explained Albert, opening the door completely. You can check if you want. It was my daughter's, said Albert, a melancholic smile on his lips. She lives abroad now, but she left the bear for when she comes to visit me with her grandchildren. Professor, Miller turned, holding the sheet music. You said you haven't had contact with Lily anymore, but this sheet music of losing another thing she loved, Albert replied, his eyes watering. First it was contact with her grandma, then the piano. She told me Richard was convincing Carol to send her to boarding school. For her own good, he said. Max, who had remained close to the teddy bear, began to whimper softly, drawing Miller's attention. The detective approached the toy, noticing something peculiar about its texture. Under the synthetic fur, there was a small irregularity, as if something had been recently sewn. Albert looked out the window, where the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange. Some things need to be hidden, he murmured, so they are not destroyed. The same piano now remained silent in the corner of the room, covered by a thin layer of dust. Carol couldn't quite remember when she had allowed the instrument, once so central to her life, to become just another forgotten piece of furniture. Carol felt an involuntary chill as she noticed how he always appeared silently, how he always knew exactly what she was thinking or doing. Maybe, she began hesitantly, maybe we should call my mother. She has the right to know about Lily. Richard sat down beside her, his face assuming that expression of concern that she knew so well. Honey, we've already talked about this. Your mother will only cause more problems. Remember how she was when we decided to stop the piano lessons? The dramas, the accusations? He held her hands firmly. We need to keep the situation under control. Outside the house, Miller watched the couple's interaction through the living room window. Beside him, Max remained alert, his ears moving subtly with each sound. The detective made notes in his notebook, recording his observations about Richard's behavior. Miller's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from his team with the first results of the investigation into Richard's past. What he read made his heart clench. A systematic pattern of relationships with single mothers, always followed by the gradual alienation of the children from their families. Inside the house, Carol got up abruptly. I need to see her room again, she declared, her voice betraying a determination that seemed to surprise even herself. Richard made a move to follow her, but she raised her hand. Alone, please. In Lily's room, each object told a story of gradual changes. The picture frames with photos of Grandma Helen had disappeared months ago. Richard had suggested an energy cleansing of the environment. The musical scores had been replaced by schoolwork. Even the wallpaper with musical notes had been changed to a neutral tone that Richard considered more mature. Carol opened her daughter's closet, letting her fingers slide over the dresses carefully hanging. At the bottom of a drawer, she found something that made her heart leap. A small diary hidden under piles of folded socks. On the last written page, a recent entry made her eyes fill with tears. Dear Diary, I miss Grandma Helen. Richard said she doesn't love me anymore, that's why she doesn't call or write. But I saw him tearing up a letter from her last week. He doesn't know I saw. I'm afraid to tell Mommy, she always believes him. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Carol quickly close the diary and hide it back in the drawer. When Richard appeared at the door, she was apparently organizing her daughter's clothes. But something had changed. For the first time in months, she was beginning to see the shadows behind Richard's controlled smile. And somewhere in the city, in a modest apartment with a grand piano, a large teddy bear guarded secrets that could not remain hidden for much longer. At the police station, Miller analyzed a newly arrived file with information about Helen, Lily's grandmother. He had discovered that she was a retired music teacher, having taught at the same conservatory where Albert and Lily's late grandfather had studied. The coincidences were beginning to form a pattern that could not be ignored. A file clerk brought another envelope. "We found this in the old records," she said, handing over yellowed photographs of a graduation recital. In them, a young Albert smiled alongside Lily's grandfather, both in formal attire, in front of a grand piano. In the background, a young Helen applauded proudly. Max, lying at Miller's feet, raised his head suddenly, his ears attentive. Hasty footsteps echoed through the corridor, and soon Carol appeared at the door, without Richard for the first time since the beginning of the investigations. "Detective," she spoke, her voice trembling but determined, "I need to show you something." From her purse, she took out the diary found in Lily's room. I shouldn't have waited so long, but Richard," she hesitated, taking a deep breath. "He was always around, always." "It's about my mother, Helen," Carol began, opening the diary to the most recent pages. "Richard convinced me that she was trying to interfere too much in our lives, that we needed space. He said it was for Lily's own good, that my mother was spoiling her too much with those piano lessons." As Carol spoke, her hands absent-mindedly caressed Max's ears. The gesture seemed to calm her, giving her strength to continue. At first, they seemed like reasonable suggestions. Then came the controlled phone calls, the intercepted letters. "I allowed him to isolate us completely." "Lily mentions Professor Albert several times," Miller observed. "She seems to trust him a lot." At that moment, the police station phone rang. It was from the team investigating Albert's apartment. "Sir," the officer's voice sounded urgent, "we found something in the guest room. Old photographs of Richard with other families." Miller signaled for them to continue. In all of them, the same pattern: single mothers with young daughters. And in all, the officer hesitated. In all, the children ended up being sent to boarding schools or distant relatives. The mothers subsequently registered significant financial losses. "He's here," Carol whispered, her body tensing instantly. Max positioned himself protectively between her and the door, a low growl growing in his throat. Before Carol could answer, Richard appeared at the door, his usual smile slightly tense, as he noticed the absence of supervision over his girlfriend. "Honey," his voice sounded controlled, "I was worried. You left without saying anything." "Max is a fundamental part of the team," Miller replied calmly, observing how Richard avoided the animal's direct gaze. "In fact, he has a remarkable instinct for distinguishing friends from other people." Richard's office occupied the entire top floor of a commercial building in downtown Chicago. While the other floors bustled with the typical movement of a weekday, his floor remained strangely silent. Miller observed the golden plate on the door, Richard Menezes Financial Consulting, as he awaited the arrival of the officer with the search warrant. The investigation of the past few days had revealed a disturbing pattern. All of Richard's ex-girlfriends shared similar characteristics: single mothers, financially stable with young daughters. In each case, the relationship followed an almost identical script: gradual isolation from the family, changes in the children's routine, and, inevitably, transfer of assets. In Professor Albert's apartment, the investigation team continued their meticulous work. In an old box found at the bottom of a closet, they discovered newspaper clippings. The headlines, some already yellowed with time, told fragmented stories. Businessman donates generously to a girls' boarding school. Child transferred to a school abroad after family reorganization. Meanwhile, at the police station, Carol spent hours with a specialized psychologist, Dr. Marina, reconstructing the last months of her life. With each session, Richard's manipulation tactics became more evident. Dr. Marina made careful notes. "And when did you start noticing changes in Lily's behavior?" In the hallway, Max kept a faithful guard. The dog had refused to leave Carol's side since the confrontation at the police station. His presence seemed to give her strength to face the painful revelations. "Richard insisted that Lily needed more discipline," Carol continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He said that piano was a waste of time, that she needed to focus on more practical activities. When I suggested that we at least keep the lessons on Saturdays, She paused, a sudden memory emerging. "He said he had already enrolled Lily in a preparatory course. He didn't even consult me." "She tried to tell me," Carol whispered, silent tears running down her face. "Several times, but I was so convinced that Richard knew what was best. He always said I was too emotional, that I needed to be more rational in decisions about Lily." In the investigator's office, a thick folder was placed on the table. Inside, meticulously organized documents revealed Richard's plan: scheduled bank transfers, enrollment papers for a Swiss boarding school, and the most alarming, documents transferring Carol's house to his name, only awaiting her signature. At that moment, Miller's phone rang. It was the team from Albert's apartment again. "Sir," the officer's voice sounded urgent, "the teddy bear, there's something inside it, something you need to see immediately." "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think it's time we paid Professor Albert a visit. There's a story that needs to be told, and only he can help us fully understand what happened that night of the sleepover." "Come in, Carol," he said softly. "It's been so long. The piano missed you too." His kind eyes shone with contained tears as he gestured towards the instrument that Carol knew so well from her childhood. "Do you remember that song your father always played?" asked Albert, sitting in his favorite armchair. "The one he composed for you on the day you were born." Max, who was sniffing the apartment, stopped again in front of the guest room. Miller signaled and Albert nodded, allowing them to enter the room. The large teddy bear was still there, sitting in the same armchair, its button eyes reflecting the golden light of the sunset. "Mrs. Helen called me 3 months ago." Albert began to speak, his voice calm but firm. "She was desperate. She had tried every means to contact you and Lily, but Richard always intercepted the attempts. She knew something was wrong." "He said many things," Albert interrupted gently. "Just as he told Lily that her grandmother no longer loved her, that she had forgotten her. But Helen never stopped trying, never stopped fighting to keep in touch. Lily started coming here secretly," Albert continued. "After the lessons were cancelled, she would appear during school breaks. She would sit at the piano and play for hours, sometimes crying silently. She told me about Richard's plans, about the boarding school in Switzerland." Albert got up, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were also a victim, Carol. Richard is a specialist in psychological manipulation. He knew exactly how to use your love for Lily, your insecurities as a single mother." "On the night of the sleepover," Albert spoke, his voice trembling slightly, "Lily came to me. She had discovered the boarding school documents in Richard's folder. She was terrified, saying that he planned to send her away the following week." A soft sound interrupted the conversation. Miller had finished opening the seam of the bear and something fell to the floor. A small voice recorder, along with several letters addressed to Carol, all in Helen's handwriting. Albert walked to the armchair and picked up the bear with affection. "Some things need to be hidden," he repeated the words he had said before, "until it is safe to reveal them." "Lily?" Carol whispered, finally understanding. "Where is my daughter, Albert?" The melody was familiar, the same lullaby that Carol used to play for Lily when she was a baby. The notes flowed hesitantly, as if played by small and inexperienced hands, but with a deep feeling that made Carol's heart ache. Miller signaled to Max, who positioned himself strategically near the door of the room. The investigator picked up the recorder found inside the bear and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room, icy and controlled. The recording continued, revealing a series of veiled threats, always delivered with that smooth and manipulative tone that Carol now recognized so well. Her stomach churned with each new revelation. The piano notes continued to flow from the living room, now more confident. It was as if the music was telling its own story of courage and resistance. Miller, who was analyzing the documents found in the closet, raised his eyes. The plan was to gather enough evidence to expose Richard without putting anyone at risk, he concluded. And you achieved much more than you expected. Helen is on her way, Albert said, consulting his watch. She caught the first flight as soon as she knew you were finally free from Richard's influence. A new sound came from the living room, no longer the piano, but a soft voice humming the melody. The voice of a child who, even facing fear and manipulation, never lost her musical essence. Carol stood up tremulously, supported by Miller. Max took the lead, as if he wanted to make sure the path was safe. Together they walked towards the living room, where a small figure sitting at the piano continued humming, oblivious to the emotional revolution that was taking place a few meters away. The late afternoon light entered through the windows, enveloping the scene in a golden glow that made it seem as if time had stopped. And in a way, it had. Stopped exactly at the moment when a family would begin to reconnect, one musical note at a time. The world seemed to slow down as Carol entered the room. Lily was sitting at the piano, her small hands resting on the keys, wearing the same blue dress from the sleepover. Upon hearing the footsteps, the girl turned slowly, her eyes meeting her mother's with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Carol felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. How many times had her little girl tried to reach her through the fog of manipulation that Richard had created? How many signals had she ignored, convinced that she was doing what was best for her daughter? Lily hesitated for a moment, looking at Albert as if seeking confirmation. The professor nodded gently, an encouraging smile on his kind face. Max, sensing the tension in the air, gently approached Lily, offering his silent support. Carol nodded, unable to speak through the tears. She sat down next to her daughter on the piano bench, keeping a small distance, respecting the space that Lily needed at that moment. The first notes flowed hesitantly, but soon gained confidence. It was a melody that spoke of unconditional love, of bonds that no manipulation could completely break. Carol closed her eyes, letting the memories flood her mind. Her father at the piano, her mother Helen applauding proudly, Albert smiling from the corner of the room. "Grandma Helen wrote me many letters," Lily said softly, without stopping playing. "Richard said she had forgotten me, but I knew it wasn't true. Uncle Albert kept the letters for me. I was so scared," Lily continued, her small hands dancing over the keys. "Richard said he was going to send me far away, that I would never see you or Grandma again. He said it was for my own good, that I needed to learn to be more like he wanted. But Uncle Albert helped me." Lily smiled for the first time, a smile that illuminated the entire room. "He said that sometimes we need to be very brave and do difficult things to protect those we love. Like in Peter and the Wolf, remember? The music that tells the story of the boy who saved everyone." The melody changed gently, transforming into the familiar musical story that they had played together so many times. Carol found herself naturally completing the harmony, her hands joining her daughter's on the piano for the first time in months. "I recorded all the bad things Richard said," explained Lily, her voice more confident now. "I kept Grandma's letters that he tried to destroy. Uncle Albert helped me hide everything in the teddy bear because Richard never looked at toys. He said they were silly kid things." Outside the apartment, hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. Albert smiled, recognizing the sound. "I think we have one more person to complete our orchestra," he said softly. "Grandma!" exclaimed Lily, getting up from the piano. But before running to Helen, she turned to Carol, extending her hand. "Come on, Mommy. Shall we play for Grandma? All the songs we've missed in these months?" Helen crossed the room with slow but determined steps, her eyes never leaving Carol's face. Years of forced separation, of unspoken words, of denied hugs, weighed in the air between mother and daughter. Lily watched the scene with expectation, still holding Carol's hand. Carol felt the weight of all Richard's manipulation crumble before the unconditional love in her mother's eyes. "Mom, I was so foolish. I let him convince me that you wanted to control our lives, that you were interfering too much." Lily let go of her mother's hand, gently pushing her in Helen's direction. Carol hesitated for only a second before throwing herself into her mother's arms, sobbing like a little girl. The familiar scent of Helen's lavender perfume transported her back to childhood, to simpler and safer times. Max, feeling the emotional intensity of the moment, approached and lay down at the feet of the 3 generations of women, like a silent guardian. Albert discreetly wiped the tears from his own eyes, while Miller made notes in his notebook, documenting another chapter of that extraordinary story. "Of course, my angel," Helen replied, still embracing Carol. She took a yellowed envelope from her purse. "Your grandfather never finished this composition. He said it was a gift for the future, for when our family needed to reconnect through music." Carol finally pulled away from her mother's embrace, wiping her tears. "He said that every family has its own music," she recalled, "that we just need to learn to listen to each other's melody." Helen sat at the piano, her fingers gently caressing the keys. "When Carol was little," she began, "whenever she had a nightmare or was scared, John would play for her. He said that there is no fear that can resist a good melody." Lily climbed onto the piano bench next to her grandmother. "That's why I wasn't so afraid of Richard when I was playing," she revealed. "The music reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I had you, Uncle Albert, and that one day Mommy would be able to hear our music again." "Sometimes," said Albert, approaching the piano with his friend's unfinished sheet music in his hands, "we need to get a little lost to find our way back home. John knew that. That's why he left this composition open, so that you could complete it together." Helen began to play the first notes of the unfinished composition. It was a bittersweet melody, full of hope and longing. Lily soon found her part in the harmony, her small fingers dancing over the keys with surprising confidence. And Carol, after a moment of hesitation, joined them, adding her own voice to the family symphony. Max raised his head, his ears attentive to the music that filled the apartment. The setting sun cast golden shadows through the windows, creating an almost magical picture. 3 generations of women, reunited again by the power of music, beginning to write a new chapter of their story together. Miller put away his notebook, understanding that that moment did not need to be documented. It was being recorded in a much deeper way, on the piano keys, in the tears of joy, and in the love that no manipulation had managed to destroy completely. The next morning, Helen's house came to life again. The windows were opened to receive the gentle spring breeze, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of homemade pancakes, Lily's favorite recipe. Carol watched her mother and daughter in the kitchen, working together as if the months of separation had never existed. "More cinnamon, Grandma?" Lily asked, standing on a stool to better reach the counter. Her hair was tied in 2 braids, the way Helen always did, with blue ribbons at the ends. "Uncle Albert said he's coming this afternoon for another piano lesson." Carol, who was setting the table for breakfast, felt a comforting warmth in her chest. "Yes, I think it's time to dust off the keys." She paused, adjusting an embroidered napkin, another familiar treasure that Richard had considered useless antique. "Mom, how did you manage to keep hope during all this time?" Helen left the wooden spoon on the sink and wiped her hands on her apron. "When you were little and were afraid of the dark, your father always said, 'Even the darkest night has stars. You just need to know where to look.' I knew that one day you would see the stars again, dear." In the living room, the grand piano that had belonged to Lily's grandfather shone in the morning light. On it, several old photographs had been put back in their places of honor. John at the piano, Carol at her first recital, Lily as a baby sitting on her grandmother's lap. Miller had stopped by earlier to drop off some documents and inform them that Richard was being investigated for financial fraud in several states. Max, who had refused to leave the family, slept peacefully in a corner of the room, his golden fur reflecting the sunlight. Carol went to the room that now belonged to Lily, the same room that she herself had occupied as a child. The walls, once neutral as Richard preferred, now displayed a wallpaper with musical notes, a gift from Albert. The large teddy bear, which had guarded so many secrets, occupied a special place on the bed, restored and cleaned. As she looked for the notebook, Carol found something that made her heart stop for a moment, a small diary, different from the one she had discovered in her old house. This one was full of colorful drawings and hopeful texts. "Dear Diary," a recent entry read, "Today, Mommy really smiled for the first time in a long time. Not that sad smile she used to give when Richard was around, but a smile that reached her eyes, just like in the old photos. Grandma says that music has the power to heal broken hearts. I think she's right." "Carol?" Helen's voice sounded from the hallway. "Are you all right, dear?" Carol looked at her mother, who was smiling with so much love that it seemed to illuminate the entire room. "You know," Helen said softly, "your father always said that life is like a great symphony. It has moments of sadness, joy, tension, and peace. The important thing is not to let anyone stop us from dancing our own music." And there, in the sunny kitchen of her childhood home, Carol finally understood. True strength was not in trying to be perfect, as Richard demanded, but in being authentically imperfect, in letting the music flow naturally, in allowing flour to dirty the floor and laughter to echo through the walls. The doorbell rang, probably Albert arriving for the piano lesson. Max ran to the door, barking happily. "It must be Uncle Albert," Lily exclaimed, running after the dog with her light ballerina steps. The following weeks brought a routine that gradually healed the wounds left by Richard. The mornings began with the sound of the piano. Sometimes it was Lily practicing her scales, other times Helen reviewing old sheet music, and occasionally Carol rediscovering her love for music. On a particularly significant afternoon, Carol found herself alone in the living room, organizing a box of memories that Richard had convinced her to store in the attic. Each photograph, each card, each small memento told the story of a life that he had tried to erase. Carol took the program carefully, recalling that day. "I was so nervous," she smiled, caressing the paper, "but your grandfather held my hand and said that fear was just the heart beating to the rhythm of courage." "Like Max," observed Lily, stroking the dog that slept at the foot of the piano. He knew Richard was bad, even when everyone thought he was nice. "It's like that music Grandpa composed." Lily sat at the piano, her fingers naturally finding the right keys, the one that talks about trusting the signals the heart sends. "You know what else I found?" Lily interrupted her playing, running to the box of memories. From it, she took out a small, leather-bound notebook. "These are Grandpa's notes on his compositions." Carol opened the notebook with reverence. Her father's handwriting danced across the pages, interspersed with scribbled staves and small observations about life. On one page, she found a note that made her gasp. "That's what gave me strength," said Lily softly, sitting next to her mother. "When Richard tried to convince me that music was a waste of time, I remembered what Uncle Albert told me about Grandpa, about how he believed that each person has their own music." "Carol?" Helen called, her voice filled with emotion. There's one thing I've kept all these months, something that Richard never managed to find. She walked to a drawer in the desk and took out a sealed envelope. It's a letter that your father wrote to you, to be delivered when you most needed to hear his voice. Carol's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. The letter was dated a few weeks before her father's passing. As she read the words he had left, silent tears ran down her face, but this time they were tears of healing, of understanding, of rediscovered love. Carol took a deep breath, finding strength in the presence of her daughter and her mother. He wrote about love, about music, and about how sometimes we need to get lost to find our true melody. Autumn arrived in Chicago, bringing winds of change. The investigations into Richard had progressed, revealing a pattern of manipulation that extended for years. That morning, Miller summoned Carol for a final conversation at the police station. It was time to definitively close that chapter of their lives. "We found 5 more families," Miller explained, spreading photographs across his desk, all with stories similar to yours. Single mothers, young daughters, the same pattern of isolation and financial manipulation. "He's going to be indicted," Miller continued. "But first, he asked to speak with you. He said he has explanations to give." Carol stroked Max's ears, seeking courage. "No," she said firmly. "I need to look him in the eyes one last time. No longer as a victim, but as a survivor." "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice firm. "I'm free." "Music," Richard laughed without humor. "That was always the problem, wasn't it? That piano, those old sheet music, all that useless sentimentality." Richard changed tactics, his voice assuming that concerned tone that had so often convinced her. "Carol, you're being too emotional as always. Think rationally." Max, who was watching everything from the door with Miller, emitted a low growl when Richard made a sudden, frustrated movement. "No, Richard," Carol stood up, her voice calm but powerful. "You were imprisoning us. But you know what I found out? That some songs are too strong to be silenced. The love of a grandmother for her granddaughter, the courage of a child who refuses to lose her essence, the wisdom of an old professor who keeps secrets in teddy bears." Carol smiled, a genuine smile of someone who had finally freed herself. "No, Richard, we are strong precisely because we feel, because we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because we keep alive the memories that make us who we are." She walked to the door where Max was waiting for her. "You know what else my father used to say? That true power is not in controlling others, but in allowing each person to find their own voice. You never understood that, and that's why you ended up here, alone with your lies." "Yes," Carol replied, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. "Lily has a recital at the conservatory today. We're going to play together for the first time, her, me, and my mother, a composition by my father." The music conservatory was packed that autumn afternoon. On stage, a black grand piano gleamed under the soft lights, surrounded by arrangements of violets, Lily's favorite flowers. Backstage, 3 generations of women were preparing for a moment that symbolized much more than a simple musical performance. "A little," admitted Carol, smiling. "It's been so long since I've performed in public." Albert appeared at the door of the dressing room, his eyes shining with emotion behind his glasses. "It's almost time," he announced softly. "And there are some special people in the audience who came to honor you." When Carol peeked through the curtain, her heart warmed to see the 5 families who had been affected by Richard, all gathered in the front rows. Women and children who, like her and Lily, were relearning to play the melody of their own lives. Miller was there too, with Max sitting comportedly by his side, wearing a special bow tie for the occasion. "Look what I found this morning," Helen said, taking something from her purse. It was an old photograph, a little yellowed at the edges. In it, John smiled at the piano, with a young Carol by his side. "I used to look at this photo in the most difficult moments, when Richard had managed to alienate you from me. It reminded me that music always finds a way back home." Carol embraced her mother, letting the tears flow freely. "Forgive me, Mom, for having doubted your love, for having allowed him to build that wall between us." Lily joined the embrace, forming a perfect circle of love and understanding. The gentle aroma of Helen's lavender perfume mingled with the scent of violets coming from the stage, creating a fragrance that would always remind them of this moment of healing and new beginnings. The three separated, wiping away their tears and adjusting their clothes. Before leaving the dressing room, Helen took Carol and Lily's hands. "Remember," she said with a smile, "no matter what happens out there, our music will always keep us together." When they went on stage, they were greeted by a wave of warm applause. Max barked softly from the audience, making Lily smile. The three sat at the piano, Helen in the center, Carol on her right, Lily on her left, exactly as John had imagined when he began composing that special piece. "This is a composition that my husband John left unfinished," Helen explained to the audience. "He called it the Family Symphony. For years we wondered how it should end. Today, finally, we discovered the answer." The music grew and transformed, like life itself. There were moments of deep sadness when the melody seemed almost to be lost, like the months under Richard's influence. But it always came back, stronger and more beautiful, sustained by the love that united them. When the last note sounded, there was a moment of reverent silence in the auditorium. Then, like a wave, the applause began. But for Carol, Helen, and Lily, the real miracle was not in the applause. It was in the tears of joy that they shared, in the tight hug they exchanged, in the certainty that finally they were complete again. A year had passed since the performance at the conservatory. Helen's house, once silenced by absence, now lived in constant melody. The piano did not go a day without being played. Whether it was Lily practicing her lessons, Helen reviewing old sheet music, or Carol composing her own songs. That Sunday afternoon, the backyard garden was especially beautiful. The violets that Lily and Helen had planted together formed a colorful carpet, and the pergola that Carol had restored offered a welcoming shade. Under it, a small audience gathered for what had become a tradition, the family's Sunday recital. Albert, always elegant in his light suit, adjusted the small piano they had brought to the garden. Miller was there too, with Max now officially retired from police service and adopted by the family. The dog wore a blue bandana around his neck and rested lazily under the pergola. The 5 families who had shared similar experiences with Richard were also present. Throughout the year, they had formed an informal support group, finding strength and understanding in each other. Their daughters were now taking music lessons with Albert at the community conservatory he had opened, each discovering her own voice through music. Helen smiled, recognizing the handwriting on the envelope. It was from one of the women Richard had manipulated years ago. After their story became public, other victims began to make contact, seeking support and sharing their own journeys of recovery. Carol watched the scene from the kitchen window, where she was finalizing the last details of the snack. On the counter, next to a pitcher of mint lemonade, was a newspaper with a small note. Richard had been convicted and now faced the consequences of his actions. But for Carol, this news was just a footnote in her new symphony of life. Carol approached, curious. The page was a little yellowed, but her father's handwriting remained clear as ever. "Your grandfather was right," Helen said, joining them with the envelope in her hands. "And today we have one more family joining our little concert of healing." "This is a special composition," Lily announced with her clear child's voice. "I wrote it thinking about our family and all the families who have found their music again." The first notes flowed through the garden, soft, hesitant at first, like the first rays of sun after a long night. Gradually, the melody gained confidence, intertwining themes that Carol recognized. There were echoes of her father's music, excerpts from the lullabies that Helen used to sing, and something new, something entirely Lily. Max raised his head, his ears attentive to the music. The violets seemed to dance with the gentle breeze, and the sun created a golden halo around the small piano. Carol felt her mother hold her hand, and together they watched Lily play, no longer a scared child hiding in a teddy bear, but a young artist finding her own voice. "Why did it end like this?" someone asked. Carol embraced her daughter, feeling her heart overflow with love and gratitude. Together, they had learned that some songs are too strong to be silenced, that true love always finds its way back home, and that sometimes you need to get a little lost to find yourself completely. In the flowered garden of that house full of music, under Max's protective gaze and Helen's proud smile, the family continued to write their own symphony, a melody of love, courage, and redemption that would continue to echo through the generations.